Have you ever felt a heaviness you couldn't explain? A guilt that comes out of nowhere? A fear that you're not enough, no matter what you achieve? An anger toward authority figures that burns, even when you try to hide it. You might think these feelings come from your job, your relationships, your everyday struggles. But the truth is far more unsettling. What traps you today was planted long before you knew how to speak. It's not in your present. It's buried in your past, deep in the first bonds that shaped your mind. And in one relationship so powerful, it can command your life without you even realizing it. Psychology has a name for it, and once you see it, you can never unsee it. The hidden root of your struggles. Sigmund Freud, the father of psychoanalysis, dedicated decades to uncovering the hidden forces that control us. Forces we don't see, but feel every single day. And out of all his discoveries, one stood out as the most powerful, the most universal, and the most underestimated. The figure of the father. Not just the man himself, but the way you experienced him in the fragile years of your childhood. His tone of voice, the way he looked at you, or didn't. The moments he praised you, or the moments he stayed silent. The way he protected you, or failed to. Even if you don't consciously remember these details, your unconscious does. And it has been taking notes since the very beginning. That early blueprint has a way of showing itself in the smallest, most ordinary moments of your life. The way you freeze when someone in authority questions you. The way you agree to things you don't want, just to keep the peace. The way you push away opportunities because somewhere inside, a voice insists, you're not ready, you're not worthy. You might think these reactions are just your personality. They're not. They are the echoes of your earliest relationship with the idea of authority, protection, love, and approval, all of which were filtered through the father figure. And here's where it gets more complicated. It doesn't matter what kind of father you had. There is no such thing as a neutral father figure. Every variation leaves a mark. The absent father leaves a void, a constant feeling that something's missing. You spend years, sometimes your whole life, trying to fill that emptiness through relationships, achievements, or even self-destructive habits. The authoritarian father leaves behind an inner critic that never sleeps. You learn early that approval comes at a cost, and that love can be withdrawn without warning. The permissive or weak father can make you feel unprotected, as if the world has no safety net. You might end up chasing strong, protective figures, or rejecting all guidance out of resentment. The inconsistent father, warm one moment, cold the next, creates a lifelong confusion about what love even is, making intimacy both desirable and dangerous. These are not just psychological labels. They're living patterns woven into your nervous system. They dictate the partners you choose, the risks you take, the way you speak, even the way you sit in a room when someone else holds power. You may tell yourself, that's in the past, I've moved on. But your behavior tells another story. Your choices tell another story. Your body tells another story. And until you see the invisible strings, they keep pulling you. Most people never look this deep. They treat their symptoms, anxiety, burnout, people-pleasing, without asking where they started. But if you trace them back far enough, you often find the same root. The first figure you looked up to or feared. The first figure you wanted to please or escape. The first figure who taught you, directly or indirectly, what it means to be loved and what it costs. And here's the part most don't realize. This story starts earlier than you think, before you had words to describe it, before you even understood who you were. The father's impact, regardless of his type. Here's the truth that's hard to swallow. It doesn't matter if your father was present or absent, gentle or strict, loving or unpredictable. The impact is still there. Because in the eyes of a child, a father is never just a man. He is the world. Children don't see their parents as flawed humans. They see them as the source of safety, approval, and identity. And whatever lessons you absorbed from him, even indirectly, became the framework for how you see yourself, how you trust others, and how you move through life. Let's break it down. The absent father. His absence leaves more than just silence. It leaves a vacuum. You grow up believing that love is something you have to chase, or that you don't deserve it at all. In relationships, you might cling too tightly, afraid the person you love will disappear. Or you might become fiercely independent, never letting anyone get close enough to leave. Either way, the empty chair at the table still shapes your every move. The authoritarian father. His rules were law, and disobedience was met with sharp consequences. You learned quickly that your worth depended on your ability to follow orders. The result? An inner critic that mimics his voice. One that never stops judging you, never lets you feel enough, and punishes you for even thinking about breaking the rules. In adulthood, you may submit to authority without question, or swing the other way, rebelling against anyone who tries to guide you. But both reactions are still chains. The permissive or weak father. He was there, but not as a shield. Maybe he avoided conflict. Maybe he let things slide that shouldn't have been ignored. As a child, you might have felt unprotected, like you had to face the world alone. This can lead to two extremes. Either you endlessly search for strong, protective figures, or you distrust everyone and insist on protecting yourself at all costs. The inconsistent father. Warm one moment, cold the next. You never knew which version of him would walk through the door. That uncertainty hardwires anxiety into your nervous system. You learn to scan every room for danger, to read people's moods like a survival skill. And in relationships, you might find yourself addicted to the roller coaster, mistaking unpredictability for passion, because that's what love felt like when you were small. Each of these patterns becomes a script you run without realizing it. You might think you're making free choices, but often you're just reenacting an old play, one that began in your earliest years. And here's the part most people miss. This imprint starts forming long before you think it does. Long before teenage rebellion, long before school. In fact, some of the most powerful dynamics take root before you even understand language. Because between the ages of 3 and 6, something happens in the mind of every child. Something Freud called the most important and most uncomfortable discovery in psychology. It's a drama you don't remember, but one you've been living ever since. The Oedipus and Electra complexes. Freud called it one of the most unsettling truths about human psychology. A truth so uncomfortable, most people deny it even exists. Between the ages of 3 and 6, your mind entered a stage of development that would leave permanent marks on your psyche. You didn't know it at the time. You couldn't have. But you were about to step into an invisible drama that would shape the way you love, compete, trust, and fear for the rest of your life. This is what Freud described in 3 essays on the theory of sexuality. For boys, it's known as the Oedipus complex. For girls, Carl Jung later expanded on a similar dynamic, the Electra complex. Here's what happens. As a small child, your world revolves around your parents. You crave the love, attention, and closeness of the opposite-sex parent. You want to be their number one, the most important person in their eyes. But there's a problem. Someone else already holds that place, your same-sex parent. For a boy, the father becomes the rival standing between him and his mother's full affection. For a girl, the rival is her mother, the one between her and her father's attention. You won't remember feeling this way, but in the mind of a child, it creates a swirl of emotions. Rivalry, jealousy, desire, fear of punishment, shame. The emotions are intense, but the child's mind can't make sense of them, and so they get buried, repressed into the unconscious. But just because they're hidden doesn't mean they disappear. For boys, this unconscious rivalry with the father figure can become a lifelong pattern, a need to compete, to prove oneself, or to submit and avoid conflict. For girls, the Electra complex can plant deep associations between love and competition, guilt and desire, trust and betrayal. This is the first time you learned, without words, that wanting something could be dangerous, that challenging someone in power could lead to punishment, that love could come with strings attached. And here's the cruel twist. These early, buried lessons didn't just fade away. They became part of your foundation. They formed the early layers of what Freud called the superego, the inner judge that watches you, criticizes you, and sets invisible limits on what you believe you're allowed to have. You may think your fears of rejection, your hesitation to take risks, or your tendency to pick partners who treat you badly are just bad luck. But in many cases, you're simply reenacting the same dynamic you lived as a child, over and over, without knowing why. And this leads us to the next stage of the story, the moment when the external parent stops being out there and starts living in here. Because once the mind can no longer fight the battle openly, it brings the father inside. Internalizing the father, the birth of the superego. When you were a child, the father figure was an external force, a real person you could see, hear, and react to. But at a certain point, the mind does something extraordinary and dangerous. Unable to win the rivalry or escape the authority, your unconscious finds a different solution. It brings the father inside. This is what Freud described in The Ego and the Id. The image of the father, not necessarily the reality, but your perception of him, becomes part of your own psyche. From then on, you don't need him in the room to feel judged. You don't need him to speak to feel criticized. His presence now lives in your inner world as a permanent voice, the superego. And here's the problem. That voice doesn't just repeat what your father said. It amplifies it. It twists it. It turns your childhood survival strategies into lifelong habits. For some, this inner father is a relentless critic, constantly whispering, "You could have done better. That's not good enough. Don't even try. You'll fail." For others, it's a voice of fear. Stay small. Don't speak up. Don't challenge authority. It's dangerous. And it doesn't matter whether your real father was harsh, absent, or gentle. The unconscious doesn't just record reality. It constructs an image to fill the gaps. If he was absent, you might create an idealized father, a perfect, impossible standard you can never meet. If he was strict, you might internalize a harsh inner judge that anticipates punishment before it happens. If he was weak, you might absorb the belief that the world offers no protection and carry a permanent sense of vulnerability. The tragedy is that you often mistake this inner voice for your own. You think you're being realistic when you hold yourself back. You think you're protecting yourself when you avoid risk. But in reality, you're obeying an internalized authority that has been dictating your life since before you could tie your shoes. And here's where it gets even more twisted. The paternal complex doesn't just influence your thoughts. It shapes your choices. You may find yourself picking partners who treat you like your father did, or rejecting opportunities that would make you surpass him. You might work obsessively to prove yourself to an invisible judge, or sabotage yourself to avoid that judge's disappointment. Some people live their whole lives like this, never realizing that they are not fighting the world. They are fighting a ghost, but this ghost has a trick up its sleeve. It doesn't just sit quietly in your head. It pushes you to recreate the same situations over and over in the hope of finally winning a battle that ended decades ago. This is what Freud called one of the most cruel mechanisms of the unconscious, and it's where we go next. The trap of compulsive repetition. Imagine playing a game you can never win, yet you keep playing, not because you want to, but because something deep inside you refuses to stop. This is what Freud called compulsive repetition. It's one of the most merciless tricks the unconscious plays on us. Here's how it works. Your unconscious doesn't just hide painful experiences, it also tries to resolve them. The problem is, when those experiences come from early childhood, before you had the tools to understand or process them. You can't resolve them in the present unless you first bring them to light. But the unconscious doesn't know that. It just keeps recreating situations that feel familiar, situations that echo the original wound, as if hoping that this time the ending will be different. Except it never is. You think you've moved on from the father who was cold and distant. Then you find yourself in a relationship with someone emotionally unavailable. You think you've broken free from the authoritarian father who demanded perfection. Then you work for a boss who criticizes everything you do, and you stay, trying to earn their approval. You think you're nothing like the father who abandoned your family. Then you notice you're pulling away from people who get too close, repeating the cycle of absence in your own way. Each time, you tell yourself, this is different. But deep down, it's the same play with different actors, the same emotional script, dressed in new costumes. Even rebellion doesn't free you. That person who can't stand authority and pushes back against every boss, teacher, or leader. They're still reacting to the father figure, still stuck in the same dynamic, just from the opposite side. The cruel part is that the more you try to avoid certain feelings or situations, the closer you get to them. Why? Because repression doesn't erase anything. What you push down comes back, disguised, persistent, unrelenting. That's why people move to new cities, start new relationships, switch careers, and still end up in the same emotional traps. They've changed the scenery, but not the script. Until you confront the original wound, the root of the pattern, the unconscious will keep setting the stage for the same drama. And each time you step into that familiar role, the ending will feel just as painful, just as frustrating, just as hopeless. But here's the twist most people miss. This isn't just your story. This isn't just a private battle between you and your past. The paternal complex is woven into the fabric of society itself, which means you're not just dealing with an inner father. You're living inside a world built around the father archetype. And until you see that bigger picture, you'll never truly understand why the cycle is so hard to break. The cultural father. Up until now, we've been talking about the father figure as a personal force, a presence or an absence that shaped your early life. But here's what makes this pattern so hard to break. The father doesn't just live in your mind. He lives in the very structure of the society you're part of. Freud saw this clearly. In Totem and Taboo, and later in Civilization and its discontents, he described what he called the primordial father, the first all-powerful leader in early human tribes. He wasn't just a parent, he was ruler, lawgiver, protector, and punisher all at once. The myth goes like this. The sons eventually overthrew this father figure, but were consumed by guilt, and in that guilt, they created rules, laws, and rituals to preserve his authority symbolically, even in his absence. This is where the first moral codes and taboos were born. Not from pure reason, but from the emotional aftermath of destroying and then idolizing the father. That archetype never died. It's been handed down through centuries, reshaped but never erased. You can see it everywhere. In religion, as God the Father, the all-seeing judge who rewards and punishes. In politics, as the supreme leader, the head of state, the father of the nation. In business, as the CEO, the boss, whose approval or disapproval can change your fate. In the military, as the commanding officer whose word is absolute. From the moment you enter school, you're taught to respect hierarchy, to follow the rules set by those above you. Religion reinforces the belief in an all-knowing father who watches your every move. The legal system mirrors the same dynamic. Those at the top make the rules, and breaking them invites punishment. Even in your most intimate relationships, this cultural conditioning echoes. You might feel an irrational fear of disappointing a partner. You might find yourself freezing up around someone charismatic or dominant. Or you might seek, almost compulsively, the approval of authority figures without understanding why their opinion matters so much. This isn't an accident. The same psychological structures that formed in childhood are mirrored back to you by the culture you live in. Every institution, every tradition, every power structure quietly reinforces the same message. Authority must be obeyed, and disobedience carries a price. And so the cycle continues. Not just because your inner world is shaped by the father figure, but because the outer world keeps reactivating that figure over and over. This is why breaking free feels almost impossible. You're not just challenging your own history. You're challenging the story that society has been telling for thousands of years. But here's the good news. Once you see the pattern, you can begin to loosen its grip. And that's where the work shifts from awareness to action. Because recognizing the father's influence in your psyche and in your culture is only the first step. The real change begins when you decide to dismantle it. The path to liberation. Now that you see the depth of this pattern in your own mind and in the world around you, the question becomes unavoidable. How do you break free? The first thing to understand is this. Freedom doesn't come from ignoring the past or just thinking positive. You can't outrun something that lives inside you. You have to face it. Step 1. Awareness. What you don't recognize will control you. Every time you catch yourself reacting automatically, shrinking back in front of authority, chasing someone's approval, feeling an old, familiar guilt, pause and ask, whose voice is this? Mine, or the one I inherited? Simply naming the pattern begins to loosen its grip. Step 2. Relentless observation. Think of yourself as a detective in your own life. Keep a journal. Write down the moments you feel unworthy, anxious, submissive, or overly rebellious. Note who you're with, what was said, and what you felt in your body. Patterns will emerge, and they will almost always trace back to the same emotional roots. Step 3. Deep therapeutic work. Self-reflection can take you far, but there are parts of the unconscious you simply can't access alone. This is where psychoanalysis or other deep psychodynamic therapies come in. The goal isn't to talk about your problems in a casual way. It's to bring the repressed material into the light, to dismantle the inner father's authority, and to rewrite the script you've been living since childhood. Choose a therapist who understands these dynamics. Not all do. Look for someone trained to work with unconscious patterns, not just surface-level symptoms. Step 4. Reprogramming. Through practice. Awareness without action changes nothing. Each time you recognize an old pattern trying to pull you in, consciously choose a different response. If you usually stay silent, speak up. If you normally chase someone's approval, let the silence hang and see what happens. At first, it will feel wrong, even dangerous. That's because you're breaking rules you've lived by since you were a child. Step 5. Supporting practices. While therapy is the main tool, you can strengthen your progress through other practices. Reflective writing to give form to thoughts and feelings you've kept buried. Mindfulness meditation to observe emotions without judgment. Embodiment work, like breathwork or movement, to release patterns stored not just in the mind, but in the body. And here's the most important thing to remember. This process is not quick. The father figure was not built in a day, and he will not disappear overnight. But every act of awareness, every time you resist the old script, you weaken his hold. The goal isn't to erase the past. It's to reclaim the power you gave away to an image that never truly belonged to you. Freedom means making choices that are yours, not the automatic reactions of a child still trying to win an impossible battle. The path is demanding. It will ask you to face discomfort, to sit with fear, to question rules you've lived by your entire life. But on the other side of that work is something most people will never know: a life that's truly your own. Now that you see the depth of this pattern, in your own mind and in the world around you, the question becomes unavoidable. How do you break free? The first thing to understand is this: freedom doesn't come from ignoring the past or just thinking positive. You can't outrun something that lives inside you. You have to face it. Step 1. Awareness. What you don't recognize will control you. Every time you catch yourself reacting automatically, shrinking back in front of authority, chasing someone's approval, feeling an old, familiar guilt, pause and ask, whose voice is this? Mine, or the one I inherited? Simply naming the pattern begins to loosen its grip. Step 2. Relentless observation. Think of yourself as a detective in your own life. Keep a journal. Write down the moments you feel unworthy, anxious, submissive, or overly rebellious. Note who you're with, what was said, and what you felt in your body. Patterns will emerge, and they will almost always trace back to the same emotional roots. Step 3. Deep therapeutic work. Self-reflection can take you far, but there are parts of the unconscious you simply can't access alone. This is where psychoanalysis or other deep psychodynamic therapies come in. The goal isn't to talk about your problems in a casual way. It's to bring the repressed material into the light, to dismantle the inner father's authority, and to rewrite the script you've been living since childhood. Choose a therapist who understands these dynamics. Not all do. Look for someone trained to work with unconscious patterns, not just surface-level symptoms. Step 4. Reprogramming through practice. Awareness without action changes nothing. Each time you recognize an old pattern trying to pull you in, consciously choose a different response. If you usually stay silent, speak up. If you normally chase someone's approval, let the silence hang and see what happens. At first, it will feel wrong, even dangerous. That's because you're breaking rules you've lived by since you were a child. Step 5. Supporting practices. While therapy is the main tool, you can strengthen your progress through other practices. Reflective writing to give form to thoughts and feelings you've kept buried. Mindfulness meditation to observe emotions without judgment. Embodiment work, like breathwork or movement, to release patterns stored not just in the mind, but in the body. And here's the most important thing to remember. This process is not quick. The father figure was not built in a day, and he will not disappear overnight. But every act of awareness, every time you resist the old script, you weaken his hold. The goal isn't to erase the past. It's to reclaim the power you gave away to an image that never truly belonged to you. Freedom means making choices that are yours, not the automatic reactions of a child still trying to win an impossible battle. The path is demanding. It will ask you to face discomfort, to sit with fear, to question rules you've lived by your entire life. But on the other side of that work is something most people will never know: a life that's truly your own. The patterns you live today are not accidents. They are echoes of an old story. One written long before you could read or speak. A story shaped by the father you had, or didn't have. A story reinforced by the world around you. But a story can be rewritten. You are not the helpless child you once were. You have the ability to question the rules you were handed, to see the invisible strings, to choose a path that belongs to you and no one else. This work isn't quick, and it isn't easy, but every moment of awareness is a step toward freedom. Every time you choose differently, you take back a piece of yourself. If you felt something shift while listening, if this conversation opened a door you didn't know was there, I invite you to stay on this journey with me. We have more pieces of this puzzle to explore, more hidden patterns to uncover, more ways to break free. Click subscribe and keep walking with me. The next chapter is waiting.